What would you do if the universe literally whispered the name of your soulmate, only for him to look you in the eye and say your bloodline wasn't rich enough? You'd probably break. But Vivian, she walked into the slums, married a scarred stranger, and accidentally became the queen of all lichens. Let me tell you her story. In the harsh, mist-shrouded territories of the Oak Haven Valley, the mating bond wasn't just a romantic ideal. It was a biological imperative, a law written into the very marrow of our kind. But as Vivian of the House of Ashdown soon learned, even the goddess's decree could be bought if the purse was heavy enough. Vivian was a wolf of respectable, albeit modest, breeding. Her father, Lord Arthur Ashdown, had lost most of the family's wealth in the winter skirmishes defending the northern borders. They had honor, but honor didn't patch the crumbling stone walls of their ancestral keep, nor did it feed their people. Her coming-of-age ceremony, held in the great hall of the Riverbend Pack, was supposed to be the night her life turned around. The Great Hall was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, filled with the scent of roasting meats, spiced mead, and the overwhelming musk of hundreds of wolves. At the stroke of midnight, the mating moon reached its zenith, filtering silver light through the stained glass windows. That was when it happened. The scent hit Vivian like a physical blow, crushed pine needles, damp earth, and a sharp tang of lightning. Her wolf clawed at her mind, howling a single word: mate. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, and locked eyes with Cedric. Cedric was the soon-to-be alpha of Riverbend. He was handsome in that sharp, arrogant way that aristocratic lords often were, with golden hair and eyes like chipped ice. For a fraction of a second, Vivian saw the recognition flash in his eyes. His pupils dilated, his chest heaved. The bond snapped into place between them, an invisible, intoxicating tether that made the rest of the crowded room fade into white noise. She took a step toward him, a hesitant smile breaking across her face. But Cedric didn't move. The heat in his eyes instantly froze over, replaced by a calculating, cold pragmatism. Before Vivienne could speak, the heavy oak doors of the great hall swung open. In walked Lady Beatrice of the Silver Pine dynasty. Beatrice was draped in crimson silk and dripping with diamonds. Her family didn't just have money. They controlled the iron and silver mines that supplied weapons to 3 neighboring kingdoms. They possessed a standing army of 500 wolves. As Beatrice glided across the floor, Cedric tore his eyes away from his fated mate and walked toward the heiress. He took Beatrice's hand and kissed her knuckles. Vivian stopped dead in her tracks. The tether between her and Cedric pulled taut, sending a sickening jolt of pain through her nervous system. "Cedric?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to look at her, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. He raised his voice so the entire hall could hear. "Vivian of House Ashdown. The moon goddess may have a sense of humor, but I do not. A pack cannot survive on fated romance alone. It survives on gold, steel, and alliances. You bring me nothing but a ruined keep and a desperate family." Gasps rippled through the nobility. To reject a fated mate was taboo, a severe defiance of nature. "I, Cedric of Riverbend," he continued, his voice ringing off the stone pillars, "hereby reject you, Vivian Ashdown, as my mate and Luna. I choose Lady Beatrice of Silverpine to rule by my side." The words were a physical violence. The rejection severed the mating tether with the force of an executioner's axe. Vivian collapsed to the stone floor, screaming as her chest felt violently hollowed out. Blood dripped from her nose as her wolf wailed in pure, unadulterated agony. Through her tear-blurred vision, she saw Beatrice smirking, leaning her head against Cedric's shoulder. The Alpha King of Riverbend, Cedric's father, stood up. He looked disgusted, but not at his son. He looked at Vivian. An unmated, rejected female is a liability to the pack's stability. By law, you have until the next moonrise to find a new claim, or you will be stripped of your rank, branded an Omega, and banished to the Deadlands. Banished to the Deadlands meant certain death by rogues or starvation. Becoming an Omega meant a life of servitude, scrubbing floors for the very people who had just watched her soul be ripped apart. Her father rushed forward to help her up, his face pale with fury and grief, but Vivienne pushed herself off the cold floor. Her heart was a blackened, bleeding ruin, but her pride was still intact. She wiped the blood from her lip, glaring at the man she was supposed to love. "I accept your rejection, Cedric," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "May your gold keep you warm when the winter comes." But bravery wouldn't save her from the law. She had less than 24 hours to bind herself to another, or her life as she knew it was over. There was only one way out for a desperate, rejected female of noble blood who refused to become a servant: the blind vows of St. Jude's Crossroads. It was a brutal, archaic tradition. At the borders of the kingdom, where the neutral trading routes intersected, outcasts, mercenaries, and rogues gathered. A woman could stand at the crossroads at dusk, wearing a veil, and offer a blood vow to the first male who would take her. It was a terrifying gamble. You could end up with a humble blacksmith, a violent criminal, or a diseased rogue. But to Vivienne, any monster was better than the monsters in fine clothes she had left behind at Riverbend. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting blood-red streaks across the sky, Vivienne stood at the muddy crossroads. She wore a simple, dark, traveling cloak, her face obscured by a thick mourning veil. The cold wind bit through her clothes, but she felt numb. The lingering ache of the severed bond felt like a phantom limb, a constant, throbbing reminder of her worthlessness in the eyes of society. Men passed by, some leered at her, others spat at her feet, knowing exactly why a woman stood veiled at St. Jude's. Then she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the cobblestones. She looked up through the sheer fabric of her veil. The man walking toward her was massive, well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the dying sun. He wore a tattered, heavy leather traveling coat that had clearly seen battle, stained with mud and dried blood. A thick, dark hood obscured the top half of his face, but she could see a jagged, brutal scar running along his square jawline. He didn't smell like the aristocratic wolves she knew. He smelled of wood smoke, old iron, a deep, terrifying scent of a thunderstorm brewing, and wild, untamed magic. He stopped a few feet from her. "You're a long way from a castle, little wolf," he rumbled. His voice was impossibly deep, vibrating with an undercurrent of power that made Vivienne's dormant, traumatized wolf stir in her chest. "I am here for the vows," Vivienne stated, forcing her chin up. "I need a claim. I ask nothing of you but your name on the registry and your protection out of these lands. In exchange, I will be a dutiful wife. I can hunt, I can heal, and I do not complain." The stranger stepped closer. The sheer size of him was intimidating, and his aura was suffocatingly heavy. "You don't know who I am. I could be a murderer. I could be a madman." "Are you?" she asked. A low, dark chuckle escaped him. "Depends on who you ask." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently lifting the veil from her face. For the first time, Vivienne saw his eyes. They weren't the pale gold or brown of normal wolves. They were a piercing, vibrant amber, glowing faintly in the twilight. There was an ancient, weary weight in them. He studied her pale, tear-stained face, noting the lingering shadows of the broken mate bond. "Rowan," he said finally. "My name is Rowan, and if you take my hand, Vivienne of Ashdown, you do not walk behind me, you walk beside me. But know this, once you bind your life to a wandering sword, there is no returning to the velvet cushions of your past." She didn't hesitate. She drew a silver dagger from her belt, sliced a shallow line across her palm, and offered it to him. Rowan mirrored the action with his own blade. As their bleeding palms met and clasped, the ancient magic of the blind vows flared to life, sealing their fates together. It wasn't a mate bond, but it was a vow of blood. They left the Oakhaven Valley the next morning, in a sturdy, unadorned ironwood carriage Rowan had somehow procured. As they rolled past the borders of the Riverbend pack, Vivienne caught sight of Cedric and Beatrice riding out on a hunting trip. Cedric saw her sitting next to the scarred, rugged mercenary. He scoffed, a look of profound pity and disgust crossing his face, before turning his horse away. Vivian swallowed the lump in her throat and looked forward. Let them laugh, she thought. I am surviving. What she didn't expect was how bizarre survival with Rowan would be. Over the next 3 weeks on the road, Vivian expected a life of poverty. Yet, whenever they stopped at an inn, Rowan paid with solid gold coins. Not the standard copper or silver of the local kingdoms, but heavy, ancient gold, stamped with a crest she had only ever seen in historical texts, the snarling, twin-headed wolf of the northern Lycan kings. When she asked him about it, he merely shrugged and said, "Spoils of war. I've raided many forgotten places." He was gentle with her, never pushing her boundaries, never demanding the marital rights the blood vow entitled him to. He slept on the floor of the inns, giving her the bed. He hunted for them, bringing back massive stags that should have taken 3 men to pull down, yet he carried them over his shoulder with effortless ease. But the true revelation of her new husband's nature came on the 21st night of their journey, as they passed through the perilous, whispering woods. Their carriage was brought to a sudden, violent halt. Vivian jolted awake as the carriage doors were ripped open. Outside, bathed in moonlight, were 12 armed mercenaries. But these weren't ordinary bandits. They wore the subtle, dark green insignias of the Silverpine dynasty, Beatrice's guards. Well, well, the leader sneered, pointing a crossbow at Vivian's chest. Lady Beatrice sends her regards. She decided that letting a rejected mate live out her days, even with a filthy rogue, was too much of a loose end. A clean slate for her and Lord Cedric is preferred. Panic seized Vivian. 12 armed men. She and Rowan were dead. Rowan stepped out of the carriage. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't even look panicked. He slowly rolled up the sleeves of his tattered leather coat. I was having a rather peaceful evening, Rowan sighed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet forest. Kill the rogue, the leader barked. Take the girl's head. 3 men lunged at Rowan with drawn broadswords. What happened next defied all logic and physics. Rowan didn't just fight them, he eradicated them. He moved faster than a mortal eye could track. He grabbed the first guard by the throat and threw him 30 feet into a thick oak tree with a sickening crunch. He didn't shift into a wolf. He didn't need to. As the remaining men backed away in terror, Rowan's eyes began to glow like molten gold. The air pressure in the forest dropped dramatically. The scent of ozone and crushing power flooded the clearing, so intense it forced Vivian to her knees inside the carriage. The mercenaries began to choke. Without Rowan even touching them, the sheer oppressive weight of his aura, an alpha command of such monstrous, godlike magnitude that it transcended normal werewolf biology, forced every single man to drop their weapons and fall to their hands and knees, whining in absolute submission. Normal alphas could command a room. This man was commanding the very air in their lungs. Rowan walked up to the leader, who was pressing his face into the dirt, sobbing in uncontrollable terror. "Tell your Lady Beatrice," Rowan whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, dual-toned growl that belonged to something far older and deadlier than a werewolf, that if she ever sends her dogs after my wife again, I will not just burn the Silverpine dynasty to the ground. I will erase their name from history. Rowan turned and walked back to the carriage. The blood on his face was already evaporating as his skin healed instantly. He looked at Vivienne, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. You're not a rogue," she breathed, her heart hammering wildly. She remembered the ancient coins. She remembered the unnatural size, the healing, the aura that made grown men weep. Rowan looked at her, the golden glow slowly fading from his eyes, returning to the weary amber she had married. "No, Vivienne," he said softly, offering his hand to help her up. "I am not, and I think it is time we go to my real home in the north." The journey to the Northern Territories was a grueling ascent into a world of ice, stone, and ancient magic. For weeks, the ironwood carriage climbed through the treacherous passes of the Frost Iron Mountains. Vivian watched as the familiar green forests of her youth gave way to massive, glacial valleys and towering pine trees heavy with snow. Yet, inside the carriage, a strange warmth emanated from Rowan, a primal heat that kept the biting cold at bay. The truth of her husband's identity unfolded not with a sudden shout, but with a slow, awe-inspiring dawn. As they crossed the frozen expanse of the White Chasm, they were met by a vanguard of 100 riders. These were not the standard werewolf warriors of the southern packs. These men and women were colossal, clad in dark steel armor, riding horses the size of draft animals. At the sight of Rowan's carriage, they didn't just bow. They dismounted, dropped to one knee in the snow, and bared their necks in absolute, terrified reverence. According to the private memoirs of High Historian Bartholomew, the most reliable record-keeper of the Northern era, what happened next forever altered the geopolitical landscape of the continent. Rowan stepped out into the freezing wind, pulling Vivian with him. The leader of the vanguard, a scarred veteran named Commander Griffin, pressed his forehead to the icy ground. "My king," Griffin's voice boomed, thick with emotion, "you have been gone too long. The citadel awaits." Vivian stopped breathing. She looked at the ragged, scarred mercenary holding her hand. "My king." "A king?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. You are the king of the North?" Rowan looked down at her, his amber eyes softening. "I am Rowan, of House Hawthorne, sovereign of the Northern Territories, lord of the Frost Iron Mountains, and the alpha of all Lycans. And because of the blood vow we shared at St. Jude's Crossroads, Vivian, you are not just my wife, you are the Lycan Queen." The revelation hit her with the force of an avalanche. Lycans were not just werewolves, they were the progenitors of their species. They were legends, immortalized in tapestries and bedtime stories. They were stronger, faster, and possessors of a primal magic that ordinary wolves had diluted over centuries of breeding. To the southern packs, the Lycan King was a myth, a boogeyman used to frighten disobedient pups. Yet here he was, holding her hand, having spent 3 weeks sleeping on tavern floors so she could have the bed. They arrived at the capital city of Ethelgard at nightfall. It was a breathtaking fortress carved directly into the side of a massive black mountain, glowing with thousands of hearth fires. As they rode through the massive iron gates, thousands of Lycans lined the streets, howling in a deafening chorus that vibrated through the stone and into Vivian's very bones. Inside the royal citadel, a sprawling palace of obsidian and polished silver, Vivian's real healing began. The rejection from Cedric had left a rotting spiritual wound in her chest. Normal werewolf law dictated that a rejected mate would wither and slowly lose their mind to the grief. But Lycan biology was different. Rowan did not just offer her a crown, he offered her a cure. Late one evening, standing in the royal chambers overlooking the snow-swept city, Rowan approached her. He had shed his tattered leather coat for a simple linen shirt, exposing the labyrinth of battle scars that covered his chest and arms. "The bond you shared with the boy from Riverbend was a thread," Rowan said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "A trick of biology, a shallow tether. What Lycans share is a soul forge." He reached out, his massive hands gently cupping her face. He didn't ask for permission to enter her mind. He simply pushed his aura into hers. It wasn't the violent, crushing weight he had used on Beatrice's assassins. It was a tidal wave of golden, liquid warmth. Vivian gasped as Rowan's soul intertwined with hers. The lingering agony, the phantom ache of Cedric's rejection, was instantly incinerated by the sheer, unadulterated power of the Lycan King's claim. The mating bond that snapped into place between them wasn't a fragile string. It was a fortress of titanium. It filled her hollowed-out chest, repairing her fractured wolf, and granting her a surge of physical and magical strength she had never known. Her eyes, once a soft brown, flared with a radiant, commanding gold. "You were never meant for a mere alpha, Vivian," Rowan murmured, pressing his lips to her forehead. "The universe knew it. That is why it drove you to the crossroads. It was guiding you to me." For 6 months, Vivian thrived. She shed the timid, obedient skin of an impoverished noblewoman and embraced the terrifying, magnificent power of a Lycan queen. She learned to fight with a broadsword under Commander Griffin's tutelage. She sat beside Rowan on the obsidian throne, managing trade routes, settling disputes, and commanding the respect of the fiercest warriors on the continent. She was loved. She was feared. She was whole. But down in the southern valleys, the wheel of fate was taking a very different turn. The wealth of the Silverpine dynasty and the arrogance of the Riverbend pack could not buy them immunity from the consequences of their own hubris. A brutal, unnaturally long winter struck the southern territories, decimating their crops and freezing their rivers. Worse still, a massive horde of feral rogues, driven mad by the cold and starvation, breached the southern borders. Lady Beatrice's vast army of 500 wolves was slaughtered in a matter of weeks, their shiny iron weapons useless against the desperate, rabid frenzy of the rogues. Cedric, now the alpha of Riverbend, found himself ruling over a dying, terrified populace. His gold was worthless if there was no food to buy. His aristocratic pride could not shield his people from the fangs of the enemy. Desperate, with his pack on the brink of total annihilation, Cedric had only one option left. He had to cross the Frost Iron Mountains and beg the mythical Lichen King for military aid. The journey nearly killed them. Cedric, Beatrice, and Cedric's father arrived at the gates of Aethelgard looking nothing like the glittering nobles who had mocked Vivien in the Great Hall. They were half-starved, frostbitten, and wrapped in soiled furs. They were escorted into the great throne room of the citadel. The room was colossal, supported by pillars of black marble and illuminated by massive iron braziers. Hundreds of lichen lords and commanders lined the walls, their golden eyes staring holes into the pathetic southern delegation. At the far end of the hall sat the obsidian throne. Rowan slouched casually on the massive seat, wearing a crown of jagged black iron. His aura filled the room, a terrifying, suffocating pressure that forced Cedric and his father to their knees instantly. Beatrice, trembling violently, collapsed beside them. Lord Cedric of Riverbend, Rowan's voice echoed like thunder in a cavern. You come to my kingdom uninvited, reeking of desperation. Speak your purpose before I lose my patience. Cedric didn't dare look up. He kept his eyes glued to the polished black floor. Your grace, King of the North, we come begging for your mercy. The southern packs are falling. Rogues butcher our people. We need your lichen warriors. We will offer you anything: gold, land, eternal servitude. Gold? A second voice rang out. It was a woman's voice, silky, refined, but laced with an icy, lethal authority. I remember a time when you believed gold was the only thing that mattered, Cedric. How quickly the tables turn when you are the one starving. Cedric's head snapped up. Stepping out from the shadows beside the throne was the queen. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, draped in a cloak of white wolf fur. A delicate, lethal crown of winter iron and diamonds rested on her dark hair. Her posture was flawless, radiating a terrifying absolute power. It was Vivien. All the blood drained from Cedric's face. His jaw unhinged, his eyes widening in a mixture of profound shock and abject horror. Vivien, he choked out. That is Queen Vivien to you, whelp, Commander Griffin snarled from the sidelines, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive sword. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, burying her face in her hands. You, Cedric stammered, his mind short-circuiting as he stared at the woman he had discarded like trash. She wasn't just beautiful. She was ethereal, terrifyingly majestic. The golden glow of a true lichen mate pulsed in her eyes. You are the lichen queen? Vivien slowly descended the stone steps of the dais. Every click of her heels sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in the dead silence of the hall. She stopped a few feet from Cedric, looking down at him not with anger, but with overwhelming pity. You told me that a pack survives on gold and alliances, Cedric, Vivien said, her voice echoing clearly. You told me I brought you nothing but a ruined keep. So you cast me out to die, choosing the heiress with the mines and the armies. She gestured to Beatrice, who was sobbing silently on the floor. Where are those armies now? Cedric had no answer. The realization of his catastrophic mistake was physically crushing him. He had thrown away a fated mate who was destined to sit on the highest throne in the world, all for a temporary influx of wealth that had crumbled to dust at the first sign of winter. Vivien, please, Cedric begged, tears finally spilling over his frostbitten cheeks. I was wrong. I was a fool. But my people, the children of Riverbend, they do not deserve to be slaughtered for my sins. Rowan stood up, his massive frame casting a terrifying shadow over the room. He descended the stairs and stood behind Vivienne, placing a possessive, protective hand on her shoulder. He looked at Beatrice. "I remember you," Rowan rumbled, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. "Lady Beatrice, you sent 12 men into the Whispering Woods to sever my wife's head from her shoulders." Beatrice screamed, scrambling backward on her hands and knees. "No! I didn't know! I didn't know it was you!" "Ignorance does not excuse treason against the crown," Rowan stated coldly. Vivienne raised her hand, silencing the murmurs of the Lycan lords. She looked at the pathetic trio before her. This was the moment she had fantasized about on those cold, terrifying nights on the road. The moment of ultimate vengeance. She could have them executed right here on the polished floors. She could let Riverbend burn. But as she felt the steady, ancient heartbeat of her Lycan King behind her, she realized something profound. She didn't care about Cedric anymore. The opposite of love wasn't hate. It was indifference. And she was entirely, beautifully indifferent to the man groveling at her feet. "I will not let innocent children die for the arrogance of their alpha," Vivienne declared, her voice ringing with the true authority of a queen. "The Northern Kingdom will send 3 battalions to clear the rogues from the southern valleys. We will send grain to feed your people." Cedric exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. "Thank you, Vivienne. Thank you." "I am not finished," Vivienne interrupted, her eyes narrowing into golden slits. She looked at Cedric's father, the old king of Riverbend. The aid comes with a non-negotiable treaty. "First, House Ashdown, my father's house, will be elevated to High Lords of the South, given full control of the Silverpine mines. Lady Beatrice will be stripped of her titles and wealth, exiled to live as a commoner in the border villages." Beatrice wailed, but the Lycan guards immediately stepped forward, hauling her roughly to her feet. And secondly, Vivienne looked dead into Cedric's eyes. "Cedric of Riverbend will be stripped of his alpha title. You are deemed unfit to lead. You will surrender your position to a commander of our choosing, and you will live out the rest of your days as an Omega. You will scrub the floors of the great hall where you once humiliated me, and you will do it until your dying breath." The old king of Riverbend didn't hesitate. He bowed his head low to the floor. "It is a generous treaty, my queen. We accept." "No, no, father, please." Cedric shrieked, scrambling toward his father, but Commander Griffin's heavy boot slammed into his back, pinning him firmly to the cold obsidian floor. Vivienne turned her back on him. She placed her hand in Rowan's, feeling the intoxicating, unbreakable bond thrumming between them. They walked back up the dais together, taking their seats on the obsidian throne. Cedric was dragged, screaming from the throne room, his cries echoing down the cavernous halls of the citadel, a haunting reminder of the price of arrogance. Vivienne rested her head against Rowan's broad shoulder, watching the heavy oak doors slam shut. She had lost a petty prince, but the universe had given her a king. And as the howling of the Lycan warriors echoed through the mountains, celebrating their queen's absolute triumph, Vivienne knew she was exactly where she was always meant to be. If Vivienne's journey from a rejected outcast to the undisputed Lycan queen left you breathless, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy romance addicts, and subscribe to our channel for more epic tales of betrayal, fated mates, and ultimate revenge. Drop a comment below, would you have forgiven Cedric? Turn on notifications so you never miss a mythic twist.